Okay, happy Monday evening. Thank you everyone who has joined today. Um, what I was hoping to do today was just to go really quickly, a couple of announcement things, and then look into the material that we have for today on our or for this week on our actual lecture material. But before I get too far, do we have any questions about anything that we have covered so far, or about the exam that we had last week, or anything like that? I don't see any questions coming through. So let me just do the announcement and then we'll do the attendance after that. But like I said, last week we tackled the exam. I'm just trying to move things around so that we all have a clear view of everything. So last week, that should work better. Last week we completed the exam too. I think pretty much everyone got it completed. There's a couple of students who did not get to it. If for some reason you did not get a chance to take the exam too, it is really worthwhile. Those exams carry quite a lot of points, so it is really worthwhile for you to get those taken. So in that case, please contact me to get an access code for the late submission. So late submission is located underneath the actual exam. I have not made it available until I get some students who need it to request the access code. So you simply will not be able to go and click there. You need to be in touch with me first, and then I'll give you a password that's a unique individual password that you'll be using to access that. So that was really the big announcement from the last week. Does anyone have any questions about that or anything else? At this point, we are now about halfway through the course, so we should be in quite a good place. And apply to all. And really, you have done almost half of the points or half of the scores that count towards your final grade. So you're almost seeing the finish line. Think of it that way. Well, what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, I think that this would be a great time for us to take the attendance. So if you can just, if you're present, please type in your name to the chat, and I'll then at the end of the class stay and enter those. The attendance is used for financial aid, and if you're any student who's part of any athletics team, or for example part of the trio programs and so on, in those cases I get reached out by various parties throughout the college asking about how are you attending, how are you doing, and so on. If you ever want an update how you're doing, I'm happy to provide them also directly to you, so don't hesitate. But thank you for that attendance. That helps me a great deal when I get reached out and I have to tell how things are going. So today what we're going to be focusing on is a chapter called Metabolism. And there's many different ways how I see different textbooks and different schools describe this chapter's content, but they all kind of tackle the same material, even though the structure, how the chapter is structured, varies, or even though the name of the chapter might be different. So we call it a metabolism, but some textbooks call it, for example, dynamic cell, or just energy, talking about energy a little bit more. So all of that has to do with this same topic. And this chapter and the two following chapters after that, so chapters 7 and 8 as well, they all deal with the same topic. So today is kind of a broader review of everything to do with the metabolism. And then on chapters 7 and 8, we look in greater detail of cellular respiration and process of photosynthesis. So they all go together in that sense. So today is really kind of getting you set up. I heard a message coming through. I'm just making sure that it wasn't a question. As always, if you do have a question, do not hesitate to just unmute yourself as well and shout out to me. I will make sure that I will answer those. So when I'm typically in a class with students, we talk about this next slide in quite a detail. And if you look at also the full lecture videos, what you'll end up noticing is that we'll talk in quite a detail about that. But for our purposes, really, I just want to highlight a couple of key points. So what metabolism and our interest in metabolism focuses is this chain where we consume food. So we eat food so that we can extract nutrients out of that food. And really the process of breaking food into small enough molecules that we can then take into our body, not just that it's traveling through this digestive tract, which is really just a tube starting from mouth, ending to the other end, with some extensions, like stomach is a larger part of that tube. Sometimes it gets thinner, but it really still is just a tube. So the big job that our body has is to break those molecules from food small enough that they can cross from that tube actually inside the body, inside the cells, and so on. And the reason why we consume food is to get nutrients and really energy as well, that we can then, through various biochemical reactions, turn into ATP. So ATP is the chemical formula or chemical currency of energy that our body is able to use for many different cellular reactions and really drive processes in our body. So the entire big first part of the process is to get ATP, which is the chemical formula, if we think for the energy, get that out of the food. And once we've done that, that's the first big part. Then there's a second big part, which is taking that energy and then converting it into something that actually helps us. In case of a hummingbird that I have here used as an example, the hummingbird helps with, or for hummingbird, we convert that energy into muscle movement so that the bird is able to fly constantly. I think I heard a hand coming up. Please let me know what's on your mind. Is there notes? I see you.
I don't think you're sharing your screen right now.
Oh, let me have a look. So the screen should have been shared, but let me just make it again. Thank you for mentioning that.
No
Let's
problem.
try. Are you able to see it now?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for saying that, or for letting me know. No, that's I'm sure it makes more sense when you're seeing what we're talking about. So really, just to recap quickly, since the screen, I don't know what happened there, probably something that I clicked. So we're taking the food, we're extracting nutrients and energy out of it through various biochemical reactions. We make ATP. That ATP is what we use then to do various things in our body, such as in case of this hummingbird, to drive the muscle movement for the bird to fly around. It could be any other function as well. So your textbook, when you look for a definition of the energy, this is the definition that your textbook will give to you. Your textbook will define energy as an ability to do work. And that's not a bad definition. I think that that's a definition that's used quite a bit, and that's a definition that's used especially on high school textbooks. So energy allows us to do something. But if we get really to the nitty-gritty, that definition has a flaw in it. Because even if we are not able to use that energy at that very moment to do something, it still exists. So really this definition, it's good, but it's a little bit of an simplistic. So let's think of, for example, as an example of what I'm trying to highlight here, that energy would be something that we get from our food. We're able to extract energy there, and that energy then we can use to do work, for example, muscle movement. But it might be that we've extracted that energy and now it's stored in, let's say, in our liver, but we cannot recruit that energy for activity immediately. It doesn't mean that that energy stopped existing. Even though it's not able to be converted to do work at that very moment, it still is energy nonetheless. So don't let that throw you off if that's the if you end up seeing that sort of a disparity in the definition. Perfect. I was just checking that are we able to, if there's a new message, but I think that we're still on the same topic, or we're all still seeing the same screen. So if I'm asking you to provide a definition for the energy on this chapter, it would be fair to give the definition that energy is all about ability to do work. However, for full marks, I probably would want you to be able to also highlight the fact that that definition has a flaw, because even if the energy is not available at that particular moment, it is still energy regardless. I hope that that makes sense. If that didn't make sense, I kind of think that I discuss it a little bit more in the full lecture videos. So what I wanted to do next is that, okay, I've told you about energy, the basic definition as an ability to do work, and how that definition overlooks the fact that even though that energy is not available at that very moment, it is still energy. We should talk a little more about energy by considering where does this all start from. So all of the energy starts from sun, and then we have some sort of organisms such as producers that convert that solar energy into something that we can actually use in our bodies. So we are not photosynthetic animals, so we're not able to really just benefit from sun on its own. We need to consume other products that are made by other species that have been able to convert that solar energy into energy that our cells can use. So we're dependent on these photosynthetic organisms. The other thing to notice is that energy, since all the energy that we see as humans, it starts from the sun, it can be converted from one form to another. But every time that we convert the form of energy, say from solar energy to sugars. So sugars are basically just chemical way of storing energy. Every time that we do a conversion, some of it gets lost as a heat. Not all, not majority, but a little bit of it gets lost. Think of, for example, when you put gas into your car. The same amount of energy that's bound into that gas is not available for the movement. We lose some of that energy as a heat that gets generated by the motor of the car. So it's always a little bit of a loss when we take these extra steps to convert energy into another form. That's also another reason why we have not been able to invent a machine that runs forever. So even though we put energy into some sort of a wheel that rotates, there's no way to grease it that well that it would just run forever. Eventually, it will need more energy to put into it. And that's because in these conversions of energy, we always keep losing a little bit of it typically as a heat, but it could be other forms how we lose. The other thing that's worth noticing, and this is kind of just putting the bug into your mind for something that we'll talk about when we talk about laws of thermodynamics, is that since energy has to come from somewhere, and in this larger scale of looking at humans and our life on the earth, it comes from the sun, it also has to go somewhere. Energy never just simply disappears. So even when we lose some of it as a heat, we know where we lose it. Energy just doesn't magically disappear. So there's the same amount of energy at the start as there is at the end. But in addition to what's at the end, we have, of course, then lost a little bit. So if you are able to count all of the conversions, all of energy, it should end up being the same amount as totaling to the same amount with all the losses included to the final energy. So I hope that that makes sense. So energy really just passes through the system. Once it's gone through the system, it doesn't return back to the start. We cannot take this energy and convert it into solar energy, at least not by our current means. So it passes through the system and we keep losing it. It starts from somewhere and must go somewhere. Energy just doesn't disappear. A good way to compare energy to something else is to compare it to nutrients. So we already talked about energy coming from the sun, passing through the system, and with every conversion, we lost some of it. Well, let's compare that to the nutrients and how nutrients behave in a system study. So nutrients instead get recycled time and time again. So we might have nutrients produced by an organism known as a producer. Then there's a bunch of consumers that use the nutrients produced by producers. Say humans would be a good example of that. We need to eat other things to be able to drive our processes. Well, what happens to your waste products or even to you as an organism when your life ends? Well, we take the remaining nutrients from your body. They get decomposed by various decomposers. That's a special group of organisms, typically contains a lot of fungi, a lot of microscopic organisms, microbes, and so on. And they break any nutrients that have been stored in your body and make them available, release them again, so that the producers can use them once again to make something useful out of them. So really, if you think of the nutrients, nutrients go around as a cycle or as a series of reactions that feed to each other. They never really end. Whereas energy had to pass through the system. Just it goes once through the system, some of it is lost as a heat, but an energy has to come from somewhere, it goes from somewhere, but once it's gone through the system, we don't really recapture it and reuse it. So there is going to be a question in the quiz, if I remember correctly, kind of comparing and contrasting how energy passes through a system and how nutrients are being reused in a system, a biological system. So that would be the big take-home message to kind of take away from these couple of slides that we had a look of. Now we get to that. This was all kind of like just getting us to think about real things. Now we get to the actual chapter material. And since the name of the chapter is Metabolism, I think it's going to be really good that we actually define that somehow. So the term metabolism, a lot of the time students get really freaked out by it and think that it's going to be something very difficult, something that's going to be hard to understand, a lot to get your head around. But really keep it simple. Stick with this definition. Metabolism refers to all chemical reactions that take place within any living organisms so that the life of that organism can be sustained. So it's every chemical reaction that we have to keep an organism alive. And if you think of that definition for metabolism, metabolism is a hugely large field, and there's a lot that we can go with it, and a lot that we can map of various different kinds of reactions that could take place in us. So we're not going to be able to do all of those, not on this class, not on this course. So rather than considering metabolism as all of the chemical reactions, we acknowledge that yes, that's what the definition of metabolism is. We pick two important chemical reactions that we'll be focusing mainly on. So we'll be focusing on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So let's have a look of what happens in the process of photosynthesis and then what happens in the process of cellular respiration. At this class, I'm simply introducing you to these concepts. Then on the two following chapters that we'll go through, we will look at each of these two processes in greater detail. So as long as you're able to take away the message that metabolism refers to all of the chemical reactions that are needed for organisms to sustain life on its own, you're doing good. Then the gaps in the story we will fill in the next chapters. But I do want to discuss true photosynthesis already today so that you have some sort of an understanding when we start looking photosynthesis in greater detail that, oh yeah, I heard about that. So when we think of photosynthesis, we're thinking of plants. Plants are able to do photosynthesis. Humans, other animals are not. And what plants are able to do is that they're able to make sugars. And what plants do, they basically take solar energy and a couple of other things and then convert it into chemically stored form of energy. So sugars, in this place, what I've written a chemical formula of is a single glucose molecule. It's just a way of storing that energy from the solar energy or sunlight into a way that we can use even when there's no sun outside. So that's why basically humans have to eat plants and other animals that we're able to get chemical format of energy, since we're not able to convert the solar energy into energy ourselves. So what happens in photosynthesis? We need three things. We need the solar energy that we talked about. But in addition, what we need carbon dioxide, and we also need water. Well, if you think of the plant, that's really what you need to do to keep the plant alive. You need to have it by a window where it can get some sunlight. And you need to water it every now and then. Of course, in Arizona, we've got plants that are adapted to deal with less water, but some water is needed. And this carbon dioxide is an interesting side step to this story, because if you think, we do not want to have too much carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, because carbon dioxide are one well-proven contributing factor to the climate change and global warming. Carbon dioxide, what it does, it kind of turns our atmosphere into a greenhouse, so that when the solar light comes to the surface of the Earth through the atmosphere, normally a lot of that solar energy gets reflected back to the space. But if we have too much carbon dioxide, now this solar light that normally would get reflected out gets trapped into this atmosphere. It works like a greenhouse. It really traps that heat and that energy. So that's why we're getting more and more heat, temperature of the globe increasing as a result of having a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that's not great. But it turns out that any plant is able to bind some carbon dioxide. So that's why you hear that, oh, you want to compensate, for example, for your flights by paying a little bit so they plant extra trees that will tie that carbon dioxide that your plane ride will generate. That went into an awful lot of detail. What I want you to know, and what's the big story here, is to remember that plants require sunlight, they require water, and they're able to bind carbon dioxide. As a result of all this, what plants do, the big important thing here was that they made sugars. And also, conveniently for us humans and other animals, they make oxygen. So we rely on plants to bind some carbon dioxide and release some oxygen. But that's not all we rely on plants. We also rely greatly on plants to make these sugars that we can consume. So even when it's dark here now today, I can still get energy even though it's not sunny. I don't have to go and wait for there like a plant would have to go and wait for the sun to start shining again. I can simply eat something, whether it's a plant-based or animal-based thing that contains this chemically stored energy. So that's the process of photosynthesis in a very, very, very simplified and very summarized manner. There is more to the story, and what's more to the story, that's what we'll look in the next few chapters. But really what you're seeing is we take solar energy, we convert it into sugars. Let's have a look. And that was what all of the plants did. Let's have a look of a reaction that's almost an opposite of that. And this reaction is known as cellular respiration. And this is what every single cell in your body does. And I don't know where that pointer came from. It must be one of my old recordings that's kind of as a ghost, since I've used the same slides a few times again, it showed up. But really, all cells in your body are doing cellular respiration. So when we talk about respiration in anatomy and physiology, students think of getting air from outside to your lungs and then from your lungs away. So you need to breathe as a whole organism. But just as well as you as an organism needs to breathe, so do all of your cells do respiration. So your cells require oxygen and they produce carbon dioxide. So why do we need oxygen and why do we produce carbon dioxide? That is because in the process of cellular respiration, we take this chemically stored energy, which was stored as sugars, such as the glucose molecule that I've included here. And we also need that oxygen for that reaction to happen. And we break those sugars apart into something that we're able to use in our body to drive chemical reactions. And that something that we're able to use in our body to drive chemical reactions is going to be ATP. And we're going to talk about what ATP is in much greater detail all the way at the very end of this session that we have together. But the big message here with the cellular respiration is that we take sugars and we convert them into ATP. And at this point, you can think of ATP just as a chemical energy currency. Well, in this process of breaking sugars into ATP, we are left with water as a byproduct of this process. So that's why our body, as we get food in and we break that food into something that we can use, we actually are left with always a little bit more water. and we need to get rid of that water. We get rid of water all the time in many different ways. We breathe some of the water away, we sweat some of it away, we make urine, and so on and so on. But this is, if you compare it to the photosynthesis, it's simply a reverse of that reaction. So whereas in the photosynthesis that the plants did, we needed solar energy, we needed carbon dioxide, and we needed water to make sugars. And as a byproduct, we produced oxygen. Now, on cellular level, all animals that don't do photosynthesis, we use these sugars and we use oxygen. We use it to break it apart to make ATP. And as a byproduct, we're left with carbon dioxide and water. Again, this is simplified explanation of what cellular respiration is. I want you to really focus on these two elements, the sugars and converting them into ATP. If you're able to focus on those two elements or to get those two elements out of this, then you're doing really well. That's really the biggest part at this point. And we'll fill in all the remaining gaps on the future chapters as we talk about those. But as we are getting ready to talk about those two things in the future chapters, the big thing there to remember is that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are almost like reverse reactions. So we need photosynthesis to make sugars, and then we use those sugars to release those to ATP. So it just kind of keeps going around and round and round in circles. So now that we have talked about what metabolism is, and metabolism was, as we remember, all of the chemical reactions that take place within an organism that's alive. Well, then metabolic pathways refer to these step-by-step series of connected reactions. So it's just a chain of different kinds of chemical reactions that are connected to each other. So this reaction, chemical reaction, follows after this chemical reaction. And after that, another chemical reaction follows. So we're basically just able to make sense of individual reactions and put them together to see a bigger picture that these can be linked into a chain. How do we get from here to here? And we would never understand that by studying just one single chemical reaction. We need to study this series of step-by-step reactions. So that's what I mean when I talk about metabolic pathways. They are all kind of these connected chemical reactions that head into something. And there's two types of chemical reactions that I really want us to be comfortable with. And they are going to be anabolic and catabolic reactions. And again, don't get freaked out. Keep it simple. Focus on what the big story here is. But before we talk about that, here I have a very good picture showing some of the most important chemical reactions that take place in our single cell. So this is a series of chemical reactions. It's a metabolic pathway. And what we see that one reaction follows another, and as a result of all of that, we end up from the starting point to the end point. But we would not be able to understand that pathway if we didn't break it into part and see each individual component of the chemical reaction. So that was our metabolic pathways. Let's look at anabolic and catabolic reactions. So what happens in anabolic reactions is, and I'm trying to find a pen here, we have small individual units. Let's say that they're small molecules or they're small atoms. And when we combine those together with energy, we can make one large molecule. So to build something big, build a large molecule out of small elements, that all requires energy. So we can't just have a bunch of, let's say if we talk about building a house, we can't have a bunch of bricks on the yard and just expect, if we think of these as bricks, them to make up a house. The only way these bricks will make up a house is if we invest energy to putting these bricks together, lining them up so that they actually make this larger construction. That would be an example of building something large out of smaller elements. So that would be an example of anabolic reaction. So anabolic reactions always need energy to happen. Well, let's have a look of an opposite of that. Catabolic reactions instead take these large complex molecules and break them apart into much more simpler, either smaller molecules or even to atoms. But as a result of that process, we're releasing some energy. So catabolic reactions are what your body does when we break apart food molecules. So you remember we had large food molecules and we broke them down step by step by step. And with each step that we break them down, we release a little bit more energy. So that's why we really eat something, that we can release that energy. And that kind of a reaction would be an example of catabolic reaction. So we're breaking down something larger to release energy. If you have, for example, a large gas, petroleum molecule, we break it apart of all of these little elements that are produced as a waste product when our motor converts gas into movement. But as we're breaking it apart, we're releasing energy, which is then used to drive that car ahead. So we will never be able to go from these small molecules into a large molecule without investing some energy. But we are able to take a large molecule and break it apart and release energy. And when we do that, we are talking about catabolic reactions. So the big thing here is to remember the difference between anabolic reactions, where we take small molecules or small atoms and combine them with energy to make up something larger, a large molecule. Whereas in catabolic reactions, we take a large molecule and break it apart into smaller elements. And while we're doing that, we're releasing some energy. And this energy that you keep seeing here and me mentioning, I have just simplified my life and I haven't told you that it is ATP. But that's what it would be. And the reason why I did not do it at this point yet was that I was going to actually talk about ATP a little later. I think I've been clicking away. I hope you can still see the screen. There's sometimes the screen gets a little bit busy and I accidentally end up clicking on buttons that I don't mean to click. So if for some reason you do not see the screen, let me know. I certainly am not trying to block you from seeing the screen. And again, it's usually better if you unmute yourself and just give me a shout out. I will try to jump into the chat every now and then to check it out. So far, what we have done, let's do a really quick recap. So far, we've talked about energy, how energy is defined as an ability to do work. And we have also noticed that that definition has some flaws because the energy doesn't stop existing, even though that wouldn't be available at that very moment. So the definition that you're being offered in the textbook as energy being ability to do work, that is correct definition, but it has a flaw. And now we've explored what the flaw is, and we've kind of been able to explain how to make a better definition. We just include that little note into that. But if I were to ask you to come up with a list of different kinds of energy that exist, we could come up with a very, very, very long list. So there's many different kinds of energy. We already talked about solar energy, light energy. We could also talk about, for example, electrical energy that travels in our electric wires and so on. We could talk about heat energy and so on. There's a lot of different kinds of energies. But I want us to focus on two of these. And the two that we're going to focus on are going to be kinetic energy and potential energy. So these two are the ones that we're really interested in for now. So let's have a look of kinetic and potential energy. First of all, kinetic energy refers to the energy that object has because it's moving. So here we see this baseball player, and this baseball player is throwing this ball. This ball has now kinetic energy. Kinetic energy can be defined as energy in motion. So kinetic energy is the energy that an object has as it's moving. If I took this pen and I threw it across the room, what you would see when the pen is in the air, moving through the air, that would be an example demonstration of kinetic energy. The other type of energy that we've talked about, the potential energy, that refers to stored energy. So in this picture that I provided here, we have these two chaps that are carrying, I think that's a clothes washer, up the steps to a second floor or first floor, higher up than on the ground level. So anyone who has ever had to help someone, a friend of theirs, knows that carrying objects, heavy objects, TVs, washing machines, laundry machines, fridges, freezers, all that furniture, carrying it upstairs takes a lot of work. The reason why it takes a lot of work is that whenever we take a heavy object and move it away from the surface of the ground, we're working against its natural ideal place of existing. Ideally, that object would like to exist right on the surface of the ground. As we are moving it away from the surface of the ground, that object, in this case, the clothes washer, it's storing potential energy into it. So this is energy that's stored in the object, but it's not being used yet. So for example, here my phone, it has a lot of stored energy because what will happen if I let go of it? It will fall down. So when I let go of it, all that potential energy, all of that stored energy gets released. We try to release it, make it available for it to then return to its ideal state, which would be for it to be on the ground level, on the floor. So if that made you confused, keep it simple with these two definitions that I've said. Kinetic energy refers to energy in motion. So when an object is moving, it has kinetic energy. When an object is not moving, but it contains some energy stored into it in relation to its position, in relation to the surface of the earth, then it has potential stored energy to it. So potential energy is always relative to what the surface of the earth would be. Or in this case, I'm on the second floor, so it wouldn't necessarily fall the phone to the earth's surface, it would fall to the floor of this room. But still we see that this phone has potential energy on it. So that's often a concept that my students are like, okay, I kind of get it, but I'm having hard time thinking how to apply it. So now we get to apply. So rather than doing quiz questions today, what I have here is a really good example of two types of energy that we can kind of practice this concept with. So first of all, we see an object, a book on a bookshelf. That book on a bookshelf contains one type of energy. And then we see another book that has fallen off the bookshelf and is on a journey of moving across the air downwards. So now, based on everything that you have learned about kinetic and potential energy, I'm asking us to apply that and work out which one of these books is an example of which one. And let's start with this book that's on the bookshelf. And on the chat, if you don't mind, again, like I said, I always take those who's been active. I would like you to write, which type of energy do you think that this book on a bookshelf has? Is it an example of kinetic energy, or is it an example of potential energy? Let's have a look of which ones are we ending up with. Perfect, you got this. It is definitely potential energy. So this book has stored potential energy by being up there. The book that's flying across the air is then going to be an example of kinetic energy. It's the energy motion, whereas potential energy was stored energy. So it really isn't that complex. This is the level of detail that I'm asking. I think that on your quiz, I have this, probably this very same picture. And I have two spots, a book that's on a bookshelf and a book that's flying through the air. And I'm asking you to identify which one of these is an example of potential and which one of these is an example of kinetic energy. So if you got it now, you are doing well for the quiz for this chapter. Good job. What I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about how can we measure energy. And there's many ways of using units for measuring energy. I am not asking you to memorize or even know all of these. We're going to stick to two, and two that are important for us. First one of these is that sometimes when we're talking about measuring energy, we talk about how many joules we have. And joule just simply refers to the work done by the force of 1 Newton. That's a really kind of, I would say, engineering definition or physics definition of energy. We're doing biology, so joule is not the best way of measuring energy for us. There's a better way of measuring energy. And the way of measuring energy that we're interested in biology is by looking at calories. Because when you look at various food products, typically we these days require that we do show the calorie content of that food product. How many calories does it have? So that's the kind of the dietary energy, the energy stored in the food that we're consuming. Well, I often ask my students that, well, how can you figure it out, how many calories a certain food has? And they're like, oh, it's there in the packaging. It is there in the packaging. But how about if you've invented a nice new nutritional nutrition bar that you've cooked in your kitchen? How are you going to be able to tell how many calories it contains? And often my students tell that, oh, of course, there's going to be lists. I can look it up that 50 grams of this ingredients contains this many calories, and then I just add them all together and I get the correct result of how many calories that food has. And that is true. We do have those tables. But where did they get those numbers for those tables then? Well, that's where we have to go to actually to the definition of what a calorie is. Calorie is defined as the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 Celsius degree. So calorie tells us how much energy it takes to bring up temperature of water by 1 Celsius degree of a known quantity, known weight of water. Well, that definition is really vague, and I would be like, okay, you just gave me a random definition. Let's see how you can still figure it out. And how we figured it out is by using this very machine that I have a small picture at the left bottom corner of the screen. And this machine that I'm talking about is known as a bomb calorimeter. So what bomb calorimeter does, it's something that we use, and I normally have had it in every single lab where I've worked or taught. These days I don't have it. We don't have it in the college, I think, at least, not in every lab. But what bomb calorimeter does, it's a way for us to take anything. It can be a food product, it can be something else, and figure out how many calories that food product or something else contains. And how we figure it out is based on this definition. The amount of energy needed to raise temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 Celsius degree is the definition of a single calorie. And of course, 1,000 calories is 1 kilocalorie. You remember when we talked about the metric system, how we could go and talk about kilometers rather than meters. We can do the same thing with calories. We can, rather than talking about how many thousands of calories we have, we can talk about how many kilocalories we have. So let's have a look of how bomb calorimeter works. And this is actually something that I think that I asked from you. I might be wrong, but I have a feeling that I asked from you either in your quiz or homework for this week or in your future exam, or potentially on both. I don't remember anymore, but I asked it somewhere. So being able to draw how bomb calorimeter works would come in handy, because if you're able to do that, I can be convinced that you remember the definition of calorie. So let's draw a bomb calorimeter and how it works together. So if you have a notepad, you have pencil, you can draw with me. If you don't enjoy making notes yourself, you can watch it. But we're gonna, for the next step of this class, we're gonna draw a bomb calorimeter. So how we're gonna do that, we're gonna take something that we're gonna measure the energy of. And I'm feeling just like today that, okay, let's draw a picture of pizza. So this is a slice of pizza, and we wanna find out how many calories are there in this slice of pizza. It's not the most prettiest drawing I've ever drawn, but with a little bit of imagination, you can see that there would be a slice of pizza. And now you have baked this beautiful pizza. You want to start selling it, make a business out of that, become rich because everyone loves it. Well, before you can do that, someone's going to ask you that, well, you need to fill in this product detail label where we tell that how many calories are in a slice of pizza. How do we do it? Well, we put this pizza inside this metal container. And this metal container, then, we want to light up a fire inside it. We want to burn that pizza. So we want to generate a fire. There's going to be a lot of oxygen that we pump into this metal cylinder or metal container, and then we generate a spark inside there. And how do we generate a spark? Well, we need some sort of a power source for that. So the power source, it can be a battery, it can be a little bit more sophisticated than just a random battery, but it's some way that we can generate a spark inside this container that we have. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna draw an electric wire here that connects on one end to a battery and to another end of a battery. That simply symbolizes that we have some sort of an energy source that we can use to generate that battery, generate that spark within this enclosed metal container where your slice of pizza is. So what this is supposed to be, this is supposed to look like a battery of some kind. Okay, now we are burning that slice of pizza inside a closed container where we have pumped a lot of oxygen, so it burns really nicely. We have given the spark, and as it burns, it's gonna release some heat. So there's gonna be heat radiating from this container that we just generated. Well, we need to capture that heat somehow. And how we're going to capture the heat in a bone calorimeter is by putting this metal container inside another container. And this another container that we're using is going to be filled with water. So it's going to be 1 kilogram of water that we have in there. So let's add the water inside this second container that we just drew. And as this smaller container where our piece of pizza that's burning, as it releases heat, this heat gets trapped. It gets stored into the water inside this larger container that we just drew. So it's full of water and it catches this heat that gets released from our burning chamber, the chamber where the pizza is being burned at. So now we have, from this definition that we had for a calorie, we have the 1 kilogram of water. We want to know how much the temperature of that kilogram of water did raise. Well, how would we find out how much the temperature of this bunch of water changed? Well, I think that the best way would be to let's put a thermometer there. So this thermometer is typically electronic, but I'm drawing an old school thermometer. Some of you might recognize those from when you're sick or when you have a thermometer outside to kind of work out at what temperature it is outside. But if you can draw it better, you go for it. This is my drawing of a thermometer. So it allows us to see what the temperature of the water is. And what we're interested in is that how much the temperature of that water changes as we burn this piece of pizza inside this container. Well, you know that temperature spreads in the water, but it might not spread immediately. So we might want to help this spreading of the temperature in the water. So we might as well add a propeller into this container that we had full of water. So it mixes this water. As the food releases its temperature into this water, as it gets burned, we're mixing this water so that the temperature spreads evenly in this 1 kilogram of water. And then we just need to figure out how much the temperature did raise. And based on that, we can do a little bit of math, and we are left with this same definition of amount of energy that was released. Tells us that for every calorie that was that the food had, the temperature of 1 kilogram of water will raise by 1 Celsius degrees. So likely it will raise by multiple Celsius degrees. And then we just do reverse math and work out how many calories did we have in this slice of pizza that we started with. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, I do discuss this in a little bit more detail again in the full lecture videos, but these sessions that we have together on weekly basis are kind of meant to give you the crash course to the most important parts of the lecture content. And I think that we've done a pretty good job of discussing what a bone calorimeter is and how it works and how it helps us to work out the definition of a calorie. So I hope that we feel happy about that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask at any time. Unmute yourself and shout out, or if you write it to the chat, I'll try to jump out every once in a while to have a look what's in the chat, but sometimes I do miss those, so don't feel that I'm not willing to answer. And as you can see, I have drawn the same bomb calorimeter many times in many ways. I have some fancier pictures, but if you were able to make sense of the process of us drawing the bomb calorimeter, and if you were able to work out how that explains what a calorie is, you're doing great. The next thing that we need to talk when we talk about energy is a concept that I believe that we have kind of touched upon earlier on when we were talking about enzymes, but we really didn't go into too great of details of talking about this topic. So we're going to explore this a little bit more now. So what I have here, I have a diagram where we have time on the x-axis and then the amount of energy on the y-axis. Along there, we have a point that's a threshold that's known as activation threshold. If the amount of energy that gets released free reaches this threshold, then the reaction will happen. So let's have a look at this situation where we have energy being released over time, but it doesn't quite reach the activation threshold, so the reaction will not happen. So even though we had some energy being released, it wasn't quite enough for the reaction to happen. An example of this would be, let's say that we have dynamite here, and we have a little piece of string that's supposed to carry that spark into that dynamite so that the explosion would happen. But in this case, what we're seeing, the energy carried by the string does not quite reach in there to the dynamite, so the explosion doesn't happen. So the amount of free energy does not reach this activation threshold. No reaction happens. So the activation threshold was not met in this scenario that we had a look. So no reaction happened. Let's have a look at another situation. In this situation, the activation threshold is met, and we actually go even above it, and the reaction will take place. So for the reaction to happen, so in our imaginary example where I'm holding a bar of dynamite, the spark is traveling down the wire to the dynamite, it reaches there, the reaction happens, it explodes. We have reached the activation threshold, the reaction now happened. So when the activation threshold is met by the amount of free energy, the reaction takes place, reaction occurs. The reason why I wanted to introduce this to you is to do with what we talked about, the enzymes. So one of the things that we learned that the enzymes could do, they could bring down the activation threshold. So now we have a new activation threshold. And if you remember our initial reaction where we had energy that peaked, but it not quite reached the initial activation threshold, so the reaction did not happen. Well, the situation would be very different if we have this enzyme present, and this enzyme that brings down the activation threshold to this new threshold. Did you have a question? No question. Okay, so what happens is that now even this little amount of energy is enough to reach the activation threshold and the reaction will happen. So this is how many enzymes work. So many enzymes are able to bring down this activation threshold to a level where even smaller amount of energy, free energy, is enough to initiate a reaction to happen. So we're lowering the activation threshold. So that's where enzymes were important. And on this week's lab, we will actually have a look of enzymes, how enzymes work, what they do, and so on. So really keeping your mind on this example of energy of activation as it relates to the enzymes is going to be handy. And I mentioned at the very beginning that we will be talking a little bit today about laws of thermodynamics. When I say that, my students often are like, oh my God, that sounds so complicated. It sounds like going to a legal school class or something, that, oh, laws and thermodynamics, two big words, I'm getting all freaked out. These laws of thermodynamics are almost intuitively clear. If you reflect back to what we discussed about energy at the very beginning of our chapter. So first law of thermodynamics is that energy is conserved. And by that, I mean that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. So we talked about that how energy doesn't just appear or disappear. Energy has to come from somewhere and it has to go somewhere. And energy doesn't just come out of the blue, so we have to have a source for energy. And energy just doesn't disappear. Of course, there could be less energy here at the end than there was in the start, but we can account for every time that we lost some of that energy, for example, in those transfer steps. And typical way how we lost that energy was as a result of heat lost. So the energy is conserved. The total amount of energy in the universe is constant. Well, the second law is that whenever we transfer energy or change energy from one form to another, so for example, from solar energy into sugars, or from sugars into movement, some of it will get lost. And the most common form of losing energy was as heat. So again, you remember when we had gas that we put into the car and we turned that gas energy stored in the gas to movement of the car, we don't get full amount of energy that was initially in that gas. We get some of it, but some of it we lose as heat on the motor. So there is always a cost for transferring energy from one form to another. If all that makes sense, we are ready to move on and have a look of one more important term that helps us to understand a concept. So this term is called entropy. And entropy tells us the relative amount of disorganization that has taken place. So this might be initially a hard concept to get your head around, that, okay, when there's a lot of entropy, there's a lot of disorganization. The way I find that most of my students have easier time understanding it is by thinking something concrete that exists. Let's think of, for example, we have a castle, we have a building that we built. And over time, that castle, that building will just slowly keep deteriorating, breaking apart, breaking into pieces. We know that that happens if you don't take care of a building. So what happens? The amount of entropy grows over time. So the relative amount of disorganization, things being all over the place, grows over the time. So I used to make a joke that everything in life falls apart over time. And really, if you think of buildings, if you think of structures, here in Arizona, I think heat, the Arizona sun contributes to that things just fall apart over time. And things end up gaining more and more entropy over time because they fall apart more and more over time. You remember that it was easy for things to fall apart. Putting things together required energy. So let's think of this through an example that might be a little bit more familiar. So if you have a room that's very tidy, very well organized, well, in that tidy room, we have a very little entropy there. So there's little entropy in a very organized room. However, if you have a very disorganized room, that one will have a high amount of entropy, high amount of relative disorganization. If you look at this picture that I have here of the room with high entropy, well, this room with high entropy has a great, oh, I'm just trying to go back where I was, has a great amount of disorganization. Things are all over the place. Whereas the room that was very neat and organized has a little entropy, little amount of relative disorganization. Well, you know that this disorder, this entropy, happens almost spontaneously. It doesn't require a lot of energy. Anyone who has kids knows this. You can have the tidiest room in the morning. Once you let the kids loose for a day, there will be a lot of disorder. So entropy happens naturally. It just happens. We don't need to put in a lot of energy for entropy to happen. You remember that when these bricks from the castle that we had fell apart all over the place, that didn't require energy investment from us. But however, to create organization, to create a low amount of entropy, that requires energy. Again, if you have kids and you have had to clean after them, you know it takes energy to clean after kids. So you know that to create little entropy takes a great amount of energy. So I hope that that example of a room that's messy versus clean makes more sense. And this brings me into one of my really sad jokes, but this is how scientists think that life is funny. So here we have a reason, explanation why we do not teach you about entropy when you're still a child, because children are very good at generating a lot of entropy, even without trying. So we're almost at the very end of this chapter. And I know that we're pushing a couple of minutes over the scheduled time. I do still, though, want to talk about ATP just quickly, because at the very beginning of the chapter, I mentioned that ATP was the energy currency of the cell, the cellular form of energy. So we're going to have a look at what this magical ATP really is. And the abbreviation ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate name tells us really what this molecule is made of. So in a cell, we use this ATP to drive pretty much all of the activities that a cell can do. So it really is just a form of energy in a chemical format that we can use in a cell. So what we see, ATP is made of 3 phosphate groups. In addition, it's made of 1 ribose and adenine group. So ATP, the T stands for triphosphate and the A for adenosine. So adenine and ribose. Well, what's interesting is that it is these phosphate groups that we're going to be especially interested in. These 3 phosphate groups, whenever we have 3 phosphate groups, so T standing for tri, which stands for 3, these are very unstable molecules. They don't tend to remain in this shape. The energy is stored in these phosphates, but they tend to try to break apart. And how they break apart is that they break apart into ADP. So adenosine diphosphate, so having 2 phosphate groups. And when we break an ATP molecule into a ADP molecule, we release some energy. So this is how your body stores energy from food. It turns ADPs into ATPs. And whenever we need energy, we take ATPs and break them apart into ADPs, and we're able to release energy. So going from 3 phosphate groups to 2 releases 1 unit of energy. When we go from taking an ADP and adding some energy, we make an ATP, and now we have managed to capture some of this energy that was around. We've been able to store some of it. So really what happens in your body, the ATPs and ADPs take turns. We keep them turning back and forth, depending on whether we're wanting to release energy. And when we're releasing energy, we're converting ATP into ADP, or whether we're wanting to store energy, in which case we convert ADP into ATP. So it's just the number of phosphate groups that's going to be important here. And really, we have already talked about an enzyme, so this should be revision. Enzymes were substances that assisted in chemical reactions. So the assistance could be many different kinds. It could be that it made the chemical reaction faster, but it could be other kinds of assistance as well. And when we talk about enzymes, we remember in this picture, I have drawn the enzyme on a blue color, and the job of this enzyme was to take this block that's drawn into kind of a wine color, red wine colored color. So this molecule that we're wanting to break apart into 2 elements, it would be broken into 2 elements eventually anyways, but we take an enzyme to assist in this process. This molecule will fit into the active site of an enzyme. And as it fits into the active site of an enzyme, we'll also notice that the shape of the enzyme will change as part of this reaction. And when the process has been completed, the enzyme has assisted us to break apart this larger molecule into smaller molecules. The enzyme returns back to its original shape at the end of the reaction. So again, we did use the enzyme to assist in a reaction that would happen even normally, but with this enzyme now, it could happen, for example, faster or with lesser of an energy investment, or bringing down the activation threshold, or in some other way. It made it easier for this reaction to happen. And remember, enzymes could be reused time and time again. So they don't really get used away as a result of a reaction. The other thing, we talked about catalyst. Catalyst was one type of an enzyme. Catalysts were these enzymes that speeded up chemical reactions. Not all enzymes are catalysts, but some of them are. And when it's a catalyst, it speeds up, makes this reaction quicker to happen. And really, that brings us to the very end of all of the lecture material that we have for this week. I know that it's been a lot of material to cover, because I know that we have now covered like multiple lecture videos worth of material in just an hour and 50 minutes, hour and 20 minutes, if you wish. But this was the crash course to the material on this chapter. A lot of the homework questions have been addressed on this quick review that we did. However, I do want to share with you, because I have had few questions about this, not on this class, but in another class that I teach, that, oh, it feels to me that the questions that we have at the homework require me to do a little bit of research or read my textbook. Remember, all of your homeworks, similarly to your exams, are open book. Since we are in an online format, homework is no longer of me testing just how much can you recall about what you learned. Homework is part of the learning process. So really, while you're doing homework, you should be also learning new stuff. So sometimes you get all of the answers from these lecture videos or from these review sessions. Sometimes you still might need to do some research of your own, and that is okay. Because at this level, we're no longer at high school, we're moving towards university, and you will not at university find every answer to every question from your textbook. You will have to do a little independent thinking and possibly independent research as well. So that's how these courses have been designed. I hope it makes sense. Do remember that for most of the homework assignments, I let you have multiple attempts, unless it's a short answer question where you type in an answer, because when you type in an answer, you afterwards get a correct answer, and then that would be just simply too easy to look the correct answer and go and type it again. So that's why you sometimes get only one attempt, but most of the time I try to give you multiple attempts. So if you didn't get something right, part of that learning process is to go back and figure out what you didn't get right and what would have been the correct answer. Because as you have noticed by now, having taken a couple of my exams are no curveballs. There's the same questions that you have seen in the chapter material. So if you have done all the work for chapter material and you have revised what you got wrong, you should have seen pretty much every single question that you will see in the exam. So I hope that that makes sense. I am going to be around here to answer any questions that you might have. But if you don't have any questions, this is the end of this session that we have for today. And all you have to do is type in your name to the chat, and then you can carry on with your evening, and I will make sure that you get attendance for also the extra 6 minutes that you stayed, or extra 10 minutes that you stayed. I hope you have a very good rest of the week. I appreciate you joining me, and we will talk more when we talk about the lab on the coming Wednesday. Until then, have a good night. Thank you. I appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I'm going to be here. But if you don't have any questions, you're done for the day. Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a good night. And I'm going to take this chance just to take the attendance. But like I said, if you don't have any questions, this is it for tonight. And this will complete our recording for this Monday evening session as well. And I hope that you have a very good rest of the week. And some of you I hopefully will see on the coming Wednesday when we look at the lab for this week. Thank you again. Have a good night.